When Julia first married into the Reynolds family, she was taken aback by their warmth. Sunday lunches filled with laughter, impromptu gatherings with too much wine, and a matriarch who seemed to adore her son's choice of partner. Julia felt like she'd hit the familial jackpot, especially since her own family was distant and fragmented. But behind the jovial facade of the Reynolds clan lay a web of tensions, jealousy, and deep-seated rivalries. Julia's sister-in-law, Megan, had been nothing but kind during the early days of her relationship with Andrew. Megan helped her plan the engagement party, offered her tips on dealing with Andrew's quirks, and even lent her a family heirloom for their wedding day. But as Julia settled into her role as Andrew's wife, Megan's demeanor began to shift. It started small, a sarcastic comment here, an overstep there. Megan seemed to think her advice on everything, house decor, vacation destinations, even parenting styles, was indispensable, despite Julia not having any children yet. Julia brushed it off as Megan being meddlesome but well-meaning. That changed the day Julia and Andrew announced their pregnancy. The pregnancy announcement came during a sunny Saturday barbecue at Andrew's parents' house. Julia had been nervous but excited, clutching Andrew's hand under the table as his father called everyone to attention. Andrew stood, grinning ear to ear, and proclaimed, "Julia and I have some exciting news. We're expecting a baby." The room erupted in cheers. Andrew's mother teared up immediately, rushing to embrace Julia, and Andrew's father slapped him on the back, already speculating on whether the baby would be a football fan like him. Megan's reaction, however, was harder to decipher. She clapped along with everyone else but stayed seated, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Later, as the group milled around the backyard, Megan approached Julia with a wine glass in hand. "So," she began, her tone light but her words laced with an edge, "I guess this explains why you haven't been drinking at these gatherings. How long have you known?" "Just about 3 months," Julia said with a smile. "We wanted to wait until we were sure everything was going smoothly before sharing the news." "Smart," Megan replied. Her smile tightened, "though I can't help but wonder if it's a little soon. You've only been married, what, 2 years? Babies change everything, you know?" Julia forced a laugh. "We're ready for it." "Oh, I'm sure you think so," Megan said, taking a sip of wine. "Just don't say I didn't warn you when the sleepless nights start." It was an odd comment, but Julia chalked it up to Megan's usual bluntness. She turned the conversation back to lighter topics, and Megan eventually wandered off to chat with another guest. But the odd comments kept coming. Over the next few weeks, Megan peppered Julia with unsolicited advice, most of which sounded more like veiled criticism. She questioned their choice of a midwife over an OBGYN, suggested the name Julia mentioned sounded a little old-fashioned, and implied that Andrew's career as a software developer would make him too busy to be a hands-on dad. "You know," Megan said one evening as the family gathered for dinner, "Andrew was hopeless with his nieces and nephews when they were babies. Couldn't even hold one without them screaming their heads off." Andrew looked up from his plate, confused. "That's not true. I love spending time with them." Megan shrugged. "Sure, now that they're older. But babies are a whole other thing. I just don't want Julia to be overwhelmed." Julia clenched her jaw but smiled politely. "We'll manage." It wasn't until Andrew's mother pulled her aside one evening that Julia began to see the bigger picture. "Megan's struggling," she said gently. "She's been trying to conceive for a while now. I think your news might have hit a nerve." Julia's heart sank. That explained a lot. Megan's sudden coldness, the passive-aggressive remarks. But it didn't make them any easier to endure. The breaking point came a month later at Julia and Andrew's gender reveal party. Megan had volunteered to bake the cake, and everyone watched eagerly as Julia cut into it, revealing a pale pink center. Cheers erupted, and Andrew lifted Julia off her feet in a celebratory hug. But Megan lingered at the edge of the crowd, her expression unreadable. When Julia approached her to thank her for the cake, Megan smiled thinly and said, "Of course. Anything for family." Then, as she turned away, she added just loud enough for Julia to hear, "Though I can't imagine pink suiting you." Julia froze, stunned. What had started as minor digs now felt like something more insidious. Was Megan truly upset about her own struggles, or was there something deeper behind her resentment? That night, as Julia and Andrew cleaned up after the party, she finally confessed her frustrations. Andrew, I don't know what I did to upset Megan, but it feels like she's trying to undermine me at every turn. Andrew frowned. Megan? She's always been a little intense, but I thought she'd been better lately. Julia shook her head. She's not just intense. She's cruel, Andrew. And it's only getting worse. Andrew sighed, pulling her into a hug. I'll talk to her. But Julia wasn't sure a simple conversation would be enough. Megan's hostility felt too deliberate, too calculated, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. Andrew approached Megan the following weekend during a quiet family gathering. The air was lighthearted, with his parents chatting over dessert and Julia resting in the shade of the backyard patio, but Andrew's jaw was set with determination. He found Megan near the garden, scrolling through her phone. Hey, he began, sliding his hands into his pockets. Megan looked up, a wary smile crossing her face. Hey, little brother. What's up? Andrew cut straight to the point. We need to talk about how you've been treating Julia. Her smile faltered. What do you mean? You've been making these comments, Andrew said, his voice firm but calm. About the baby, about us being unprepared. And Julia's been feeling really hurt. Megan's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely taken aback. Hurt? Andrew, that wasn't my intention at all. I've just been giving her advice, trying to be helpful. It doesn't feel that way, Andrew said. It feels like you're picking at everything she does. And it's not okay. Megan pressed her lips together, glancing toward the patio where Julia sat, oblivious to their conversation. I guess I didn't realize it was coming across that way, she said quietly, but there was something in her tone, an edge that Andrew couldn't ignore. Look, he continued, I know things have been hard for you. Mom told me about you trying for a baby, and I'm sorry. I really am. But that doesn't mean you can take it out on Julia. At that, Megan stiffened. Her voice turned cold. I see Mom's been running her mouth again. She didn't mean anything by it, Andrew said quickly. She's just worried. We all are. Worried? Megan let out a bitter laugh. That I'm turning into some kind of villain? Give me a break, Andrew. I'm happy for you. For both of you. But excuse me if I don't feel like throwing a parade while I'm drowning over here. Andrew was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to be so blunt. I get that it's hard, he said. But you don't have to be cruel to Julia. I'm not cruel, Megan snapped, her voice rising slightly. She glanced toward the patio again, then lowered her tone. You think you know everything, don't you? You think this little perfect life of yours means you get to sit there and judge me. Megan, that's not what this is about, Andrew said, his frustration mounting. I just want you to show Julia some respect. She's family, and she deserves that much. Megan crossed her arms, her jaw tight. Fine, she said. If it'll make you happy, I'll keep my mouth shut. Andrew sighed, sensing he wasn't going to get anything more from her. Thank you, he said, turning to leave. But as he walked away, Megan called after him, her voice carrying a sharp edge. Just remember, Andrew, perfect little families don't stay perfect forever. The words chilled him, but he forced himself not to look back. Later that evening, Andrew recounted the conversation to Julia. She listened quietly, her hands resting protectively over her growing belly. What do you think she meant by that? Julia asked when he finished. I don't know, Andrew admitted. She's angry, jealous maybe, but I don't think she'd actually do anything. Julia bit her lip, unsure. Megan's recent behavior didn't leave much room for trust. I hope you're right, she said softly. But in the weeks that followed, Megan's behavior didn't improve, it got worse. She started showing up uninvited, lurking in the background of family events, and making passive-aggressive remarks when she thought no one was listening. One evening, Julia found Megan flipping through baby books she'd left on the coffee table. Looking for names? Megan asked sweetly. Or just inspiration for future disappointment? Julia clenched her fists. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice trembling. Megan shrugged. Doing what? Trying to ruin this for me. For us. For a moment, Megan's face softened, and Julia thought she might actually get an apology. But then Megan smirked. If you think I'm ruining things now, she said, just wait. Julia stared at her, horrified. The words weren't just a threat. They felt like a promise. Julia couldn't shake Megan's ominous words. If you think I'm ruining things now, just wait. They echoed in her mind for days, a persistent hum beneath her otherwise joyful preparations for the baby. When she told Andrew what Megan had said, his face darkened. That's it, Andrew said firmly. She's done. She doesn't get to treat you this way, Julia. I'll talk to my parents. We need to set some boundaries. Julia nodded, but deep down, she doubted boundaries would stop Megan. She'd seen the intensity in her sister-in-law's eyes, the way resentment seemed to coil tighter with every interaction. This wasn't about setting rules. This was personal. Andrew kept his word. That weekend, he sat down with his parents and explained everything. Megan's comments, her invasive behavior, and her parting threat to Julia. His mother looked distraught, torn between defending her daughter and acknowledging her faults. His father, however, didn't mince words. This has gone too far, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice firm. Megan needs help, and until she gets it, she shouldn't be around Julia or the baby. Andrew's mother opened her mouth to protest, but he silenced her with a look. We're not cutting her off, Caroline, but we can't ignore this anymore. Julia was relieved to have their support, but the conversation only seemed to fan the flames. When Megan found out about the meeting, she sent Julia a string of texts that veered wildly between tearful apologies and outright hostility. Megan, I can't believe you're turning my family against me. Megan, you don't deserve Andrew. Megan, I'm sorry if I've been harsh, but you have to understand. It's been so hard for me. Megan, you'll regret this. Julia showed the messages to Andrew, who immediately blocked Megan's number. We're not engaging with her anymore, he said. If she has something to say, she can go through me. But Megan wasn't one to back down easily. 2 weeks later, Julia and Andrew returned home from a routine doctor's appointment to find their front door ajar. Andrew stepped inside cautiously, his hand on Julia's arm to keep her behind him. The house seemed undisturbed at first. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. But when they reached the nursery, Julia's breath caught in her throat. The once cozy room, painted in soft pastels and filled with carefully chosen baby items, had been ransacked. The crib was overturned, baby clothes were strewn across the floor, and the framed sonogram photo on the dresser was smashed. Andrew's face turned white with fury. Megan, he muttered under his breath. Julia leaned against the doorframe, trembling. How could she do this? Andrew immediately called the police, and while they waited for officers to arrive, he phoned his parents. His mother sounded horrified, swearing Megan couldn't have been responsible, but his father was less convinced. Megan's been spiraling, Mr. Reynolds said grimly. We'll come over. The police arrived and took their statements, noting that there were no signs of forced entry. Julia and Andrew hadn't seen Megan in weeks, but they couldn't think of anyone else who would target them this way. The officers assured them they'd investigate, but offered little immediate comfort. That evening, Andrew's parents arrived to help clean up the mess. His mother looked pale and shaken, wringing her hands as she surveyed the nursery. This doesn't make sense, she said. Megan wouldn't. She wouldn't do this. Andrew didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his father. Can we check your house's security cameras? Maybe Megan was there today. His father hesitated, then nodded. We can. But if this was her, he trailed off, shaking his head. The footage from the Reynolds home showed Megan leaving around midday, the exact time Julia and Andrew were at their appointment. She carried a small bag and got into her car without speaking to anyone. She looks normal, Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice wavering. She was probably just running errands. But Andrew wasn't so sure. The next morning, he contacted Megan directly, ignoring Julia's protests. I need to hear it from her, he said. Megan answered on the second ring, her voice unusually bright. Andrew, what a surprise. Cut the act, he said. Did you come to our house yesterday? There was a long pause. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Megan, Andrew said. The nursery was trashed. Someone broke in, and the police are involved. If it was you, now's the time to own up. Her laughter was sharp and bitter. Do you really think I'd waste my time on your stupid nursery? God, Andrew, you're paranoid. But something about the way she said it made Andrew's stomach turn. It wasn't a denial. It was a dare. When he hung up, Julia was waiting. "What did she say?" she asked. Andrew shook his head, his jaw tight. "She denied everything. But Julia, I think this is just the beginning." The days that followed were tense. Julia and Andrew reinforced the locks on their doors and installed a security system with cameras around the house. The police investigation was ongoing, but without concrete evidence tying Megan to the break-in, there wasn't much they could do. Julia tried to focus on her pregnancy, but the unease lingered like a shadow in every corner of her mind. One evening, as Andrew worked late, Julia sat alone in the living room, sorting through baby clothes. She'd just begun folding a tiny onesie when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up, expecting a message from Andrew, but her stomach sank when she saw Megan's name. "Megan, how's the nursery coming along?" Julia's hands shook as she read the message. She hadn't told Megan, or anyone outside the family, about the vandalized nursery. Her heart raced as she typed a response. "Julia, what do you want, Megan?" The reply came almost instantly. "Megan, just checking in. You've been on my mind." Smiling face with smiling eyes. Julia stared at the screen, her fear quickly giving way to anger. She was tired of being intimidated, tired of Megan's games. "Julia, stay away from us." This time, Megan didn't respond, but Julia could almost feel her smirking on the other side of the screen. She put her phone down and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But the momentary calm shattered when she heard a noise. A faint knock at the front door. Julia froze. It was almost 10 p.m., and she wasn't expecting anyone. She reached for her phone and dialed Andrew, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Someone's at the door." "Don't answer it," Andrew said immediately. "Lock yourself in the bedroom and call the police." "I'm on my way." Julia grabbed the baby monitor and hurried upstairs, locking herself in the bedroom as Andrew had instructed. She called the police and explained the situation, her voice shaking. As she waited, she strained to hear any sound from downstairs, but the house was eerily silent. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the street. Julia stayed upstairs until an officer knocked on the bedroom door to let her know it was safe. When she came downstairs, she found 2 officers standing in the living room with Andrew, who had just arrived. "There's no sign of forced entry," one officer said, "but we'll review your security footage to see if anyone approached the house." Andrew thanked them, his arm wrapped protectively around Julia. After the officers left, he pulled her into a hug. "I'm so sorry, Jules. I should have been here." "It's not your fault," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. But as they sat down to review the security footage, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the knock at the door had been more than a scare tactic. The footage revealed a figure standing at their front door, cloaked in a hoodie that obscured their face. The person knocked twice, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Julia's heart sank. "It has to be Megan," Andrew said, his voice low. "But how do we prove it?" Julia asked. Andrew didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his phone and dialed his father. The next morning, Mr. Reynolds showed up at their house, looking grim. "I spoke to Megan last night," he said. "She denied everything, of course, but something feels off. Caroline and I agree. It's time to cut her off completely." Andrew nodded, his expression hard. "She's out of control, Dad, and I'm not letting her put Julia, or the baby, at risk." But as much as Julia wanted to believe that cutting ties with Megan would solve the problem, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. Megan's behavior had already escalated, and Julia had no doubt she was capable of worse. 2 nights later, that fear was realized. Julia woke suddenly, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what had roused her until she smelled it. Smoke? "Andrew!" she cried, shaking him awake. Andrew bolted upright, coughing as the acrid smell filled the room. "Stay here," he said, rushing out of the bedroom. But Julia didn't stay put. She followed him downstairs, where they found the source of the smoke, a small fire smoldering on their back porch. It had been started with what looked like crumpled newspapers and a bottle of lighter fluid, both discarded nearby. Andrew grabbed the garden hose and quickly doused the flames, but the implications were clear. This wasn't an accident. The next morning, As the police combed through the evidence, Julia sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. "What if this doesn't stop?" she asked Andrew, her voice trembling. "It will," Andrew said, his jaw tight. "We're going to make sure of it." Julia met his gaze, her fear giving way to determination. "She's not going to take this away from us," she said. "Not our family. Not our happiness." Andrew nodded, taking her hand. "We'll do whatever it takes." The escalating chaos surrounding Megan couldn't be ignored any longer. The fire on the porch was the final straw for Julia and Andrew. With the evidence mounting and their nerves frayed to the breaking point, they knew it was time to take decisive action. The police launched a full investigation, focusing on the security footage from the night of the fire. The blurry image of the hooded figure matched the previous night's footage of someone knocking on their door. While the face wasn't visible, the figure's build and movements were unmistakably familiar to Andrew. "It's Megan," he told the officer assigned to their case. "I'd bet anything on it." A week later, the police called with a breakthrough. They tracked down the purchase of the lighter fluid and newspapers used in the fire to a gas station near Megan's apartment. Surveillance footage from the store showed her at the counter, paying in cash, wearing the same hoodie captured on Julia and Andrew's security cameras. It was enough for an arrest warrant. The knock at the door this time wasn't from Megan. It was from the officers informing Julia and Andrew that Megan had been taken into custody. Andrew exhaled deeply, the weight of the last few months momentarily lifting. But Julia wasn't celebrating yet. "Do you think this will really stop her?" she asked softly. Andrew took her hand. "It has to." Megan's arrest sent shockwaves through the family. Andrew's parents were devastated, but couldn't deny the evidence. Caroline tried to visit Megan in jail, but Megan refused to see her. A month later, the case went to court. Megan pleaded guilty to charges of arson and harassment. During sentencing, her defense attorney painted a picture of a woman unraveling under the weight of infertility, jealousy, and unresolved family tensions. Megan herself spoke, apologizing tearfully to Julia and Andrew, but claiming she never intended to hurt them physically. Julia sat in the courtroom, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and faced Megan directly. "I understand that you're hurting," Julia said, her voice steady. "And I'm sorry for the pain you've gone through. But what you've done to me, to Andrew, and to our family is unforgivable. You put my life, and my baby's life, in danger. I hope you find the help you need, but I can't have you in our lives anymore." Megan sobbed quietly as Julia sat back down. The judge sentenced her to 2 years in prison with mandatory counseling and a restraining order barring her from contacting Julia or Andrew. The months that followed were a slow journey toward healing. Julia and Andrew focused on preparing for their baby's arrival, finding solace in the small joys of assembling the nursery, choosing names, and imagining the life they were building together. When their daughter, Lily, was born, the pain of the past few months melted away, at least for a while. Andrew held Julia's hand as she cradled their newborn, tears streaming down both their faces. "She's perfect," Julia whispered. "She's our fresh start," Andrew replied. Megan remained a shadow in their lives, occasionally reaching out through letters that went unread. Andrew's parents visited her in prison, but their relationship with her was strained, and they supported Julia and Andrew's decision to keep their distance. As Lily grew, the scars from Megan's actions began to fade. Julia and Andrew created a home filled with love, laughter, and safety, a home where fear had no place. And while the events of the past lingered as a painful memory, they served as a reminder of the strength they'd found in each other. In the end, it wasn't Megan's threats or schemes that defined them. It was their resilience, their love, and the family they'd built despite everything.